Yeah, I've been doing a lot of engineering for a long time, I guess, at this point. And I started, I went into graduate school and got a PhD in robotics, actually. So I spent about 7 years of my life messing around with robots. And actually, you can't see it, but in another corner of the basement, there's a robot over there,
Oh, cool.
which is fun. Actually, a couple. I have a couple. Um, they're old. Um, like they were old when I left graduate school, so that's anyway. I worked as was mentioned, I worked at Google on web search, and then on cloud, and started the Kubernetes project. Now, gosh, it was close to 7 years ago, which is kind of remarkable. Um, Came over. I'm from Seattle. Grew up in Seattle, and so coming to Microsoft was really a natural home for me. And and have been focused on a bunch of different things actually since coming to Microsoft, including the Azure Resource Manager, and policy and governance, and thinking about how people manage and deploy their applications and their lifecycle of their applications into Azure. Obviously, the Kubernetes service, also generally Linux on Azure and open source applications on Azure. And lately as well, the Service Fabric teams and the SAP teams. So pretty broad portfolio. I'm happy to actually answer questions on any of that. And I did bring a whiteboard, so I'm gonna, if the questions are apt for screen sharing and whiteboarding, that is the medium that I like to do. So I was a professor for a couple of years. I guess I didn't mention that. I was a college professor for a couple of years. So I miss being up at the whiteboard. So this is an opportunity to do that. So hopefully it's enjoyable.
So we love whiteboard sessions too, because we love that whole dialogue and visual explanations. So
Yeah.
Brendan, I've got the questions in front of me that we sent to start you off. Shall we kick off with some of those and get you flexing your whiteboard muscles, and we'll see if people post questions in the stream as we go forward?
Sure, sounds good. I just shared the whiteboard, so hopefully you can see that. There's not much.
Excellent. So no pressure for the first one. Will containers take over completely? And when they do, how will containers be easy for the straightforward use cases of cloud?
Oh yeah, it's an interesting question. It's something we think a lot about actually, um, and that's because I think there's different things to think about, right? So I think that
Sorry,
I think
Brendan, can
I
I
think.
just interrupt a sec?
Oh
Would you
yeah, no,
mind?
please.
Could you minimize the little Skype window that's sitting
Yeah.
over the top of the whiteboard?
How's that?
Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry,
Awesome.
carry on.
Yeah, I know it's always embarrassing to see yourself broadcasted through your anyway. Um, yeah. So I think there's a bunch of different things to think about. It's like when we're talking about the container, we're talking about, so if we put a container here, there's different aspects to this. I think one of the aspects is actually just sort of the packaging. Oops, that's not. I didn't mean that. I didn't want a pentagon. One of the aspects is the packaging, which is sort of the box that we put and we push it around the world. So that might be the thing we push to the cloud, or it might be the thing that runs on a particular computer. Here's my computer. It's not a very good computer, but that's life. And I think that packaging, so the packaging of something as a container image is going to stay around. I don't see any reason why anyone will invent a new way of packaging up code or a new way of telling a machine or an orchestration system what to execute. The things that we have work pretty well. They have some nice characteristics. They were designed for particular things. We might refine them a little bit, but that idea of the container image is going to stick around forever, I think, and take over most computing. However, I think the thing is that most people aren't going to necessarily pay attention to that, right? Because the other side of this is, how does the person who's writing the code, how do they get their code into the container? And I think that's the area that can be hard. And that's also the area where the most work has to happen. And so you can imagine, you can provide, and we do actually provide today, an Azure Functions kind of experience where you can just give yourself a little snippet of code, and behind the scenes, this thing can get packaged as a container and it can run on Kubernetes. But from a developer perspective, you're just running serverless code, right? And there's event handlers that will activate. So there's some sort of queue, and items going into the queue will cause that function to run, right? So I think I would separate the question around like, is containers going to take over everything, into the technical aspects of an execution environment and a format for a program to run. And I think that's just going to stick around because it's useful. It's a very useful abstraction, versus the development environment or the programming model that a developer uses to build an application. And I think there you see a heterogeneity already between things like app services, Azure Functions, a whole bunch of other different models, either open source or in the cloud, around how do I get my code into a container. And I think that trend's going to continue. And I think it's going to go even beyond, because what I've focused on so far is, I'll clear this out. What I've focused on so far is individual containers, but the truth is that most applications are made up of lots of containers, usually from different sort of microservices. And the question of how does a developer create that, right? How do I describe this whole thing is even more complicated. And I think we're going to see tooling come and try and address that as well, because I think that not only is it hard to get your code inside of a container, it's also hard to express sort of how all of the services that make up your application come together. I'm hopeful. I mean, this is actually the most interesting problem I think we're working on, or certainly one of the most interesting problems we're working on right now. And we've got great people to talk to in like the .NET team and in dev generally, as well as in the open source communities. And so I expect over the next 5 years, if we spent the last sort of 5 to 7 years getting the Kubernetes infrastructure mostly finished, the next 5 to 7 years are going to be figuring out how we actually make it easy to build applications for it. So kind of long-winded, but hopefully an interesting answer. All right.
Okay. So I was expecting Izzy to chip in there, but
sorry, yeah, absolutely. Here I am. Yeah, definitely. So thank you very much. So let's check and what's the next question. So here's the question. There are concerns that AKS is too expensive for most small shops. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think at some level it is, because like the drop charge, I mean, the smallest cluster that you can run is probably about $100 a month, mm-hmm. 100 US a month, which is pretty expensive. It's pretty expensive. I mean, it depends on what you do with it, right? I mean, you could be a web hosting shop or something like that, and you could put lots of applications. If you have your three nodes, okay, 3 nodes in your cluster, you can put lots and lots and lots of containers on that cluster and sort of amortize the cost of that $100 across a bunch of different sites if you wanted to. But yeah, I mean, $100 is a lot, right? And so if we think about this being the Kubernetes API layer, I think one of the things that we're really trying to do, and it's not done yet, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to take those machines, those VMs, and we're trying to delete them, and we're trying to replace them with serverless containers. And this is basically ACI, right? So this is the virtual nodes work that we have right now. And unfortunately right now, because some of the ways that Kubernetes works, and some other details of how Azure load balancers work and some other stuff like that, right now you can't, when you have those virtual nodes, you still have to have a couple VMs. And so we're going to pretend that was a square. So you still have to have a couple of VMs even with virtual nodes. And so you still pay money. But I think as we go forward, we're going to get to a place where you can have pure serverless, right? We'll get rid of all of this. And so you only pay for the compute that you need and the compute that you use. And at that point, it becomes cheaper. Although I think one of the challenges that we always have is for especially for sort of really small stuff is that, one of the things I always think about is like there's kind of two cases in the world. There's 0 to 1, and there's 1 to n. And paying IaaS pricing in the 0 to 1 case doesn't usually make sense because your IaaS is idle most of the time, right? It's just sitting there. If I have a little speed gauge, it's just sitting there, at 0% and so you're paying money constantly for something that's not in use. And that's why, an event-driven model like functions. So functions as a service where when you're idle, you're just sleeping. That event-driven model makes a lot more sense at 0 to 1. Now, the funny thing is it flips around, right? So when you're in the 1 to n case, IaaS is actually, because you peg the CPU, IaaS is pretty cheap, and FaaS, because you're paying for every request, is actually quite expensive. And this has kind of been an ongoing struggle in cloud in general, because a lot of people start in the FaaS world, and it's great, and then they hit this point where it's like, oh, actually, it's not great because it's really expensive up when I can saturate a core, and I have to figure out now how to go to IaaS. And so I think part of the goals in providing these richer developer experiences is to give people continuity, so that you can start small in functions as a service, pay only for your requests that you have, but then when you get big enough, you end up running in a Kubernetes cluster, paying infrastructure costs. So I think that's the way that we approach this, is hopefully giving people developer experiences that can span from whatever sort of funding model works best for their particular environment. So.
Awesome, thank you. I do have to say I really like this concept of the whiteboard session. It's very interesting to hear you answer the questions as well as follow everything what's happening on the whiteboard.
That's good. I also sorry, I wanted to add one other thing. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
That I forgot to mention. The other thing that we do have is we do now have spot instance support for AKS, and that's dramatically cheaper. Although obviously it comes with a little bit of a reliability hit because you could get evicted. So go ahead.
That segues quite nicely, Brendan. We've been watching the chat, and I want to squash together two questions. One from the chat from fellow MVP Tom Kirkove, who's involved in CADA, does a lot of work with containers, and he's saying that ACI is great, but it doesn't have auto scaling. AKS has auto scaling, but the size and complexity means it might be a bridge too far for smaller apps. And interestingly, tying into that, yesterday we had Vishwas Lele on the stream, and we said if you could ask Brendan one question, what would it be? And it ties quite nicely into what Tom was saying, because Vishwas wants to know really when you're going to make AKS a bit more PaaS-y. So things like scaling will be automatic. So size might be a bit more automatic. So maybe spanning that gap that Tom's identifying between ACI and its big brother AKS.
Yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing question. I really think that ACI is a low-level primitive, right? And AKS is roughly in the same boat, but more complex, as you say. So we put AKS maybe a little bit higher, but roughly in the same a boat. What I want to actually see us do is, and of course, if we do virtual nodes, this is actually connected to ACI, the virtual nodes. What I actually want to see us do is, and this gets back in some ways to the answer to the earlier question, I want to see us lay in higher level experiences that you can use to achieve this. So I don't necessarily want to make AKS more PaaS-like, but what I do want to do is bridge the gap between things like app services and AKS, so that if I want to interact with AKS at a PaaS layer, I can interact there and I can get the support, right? Because there's a couple different aspects to PaaS. One is the developer experience. And you can basically have the developer experience today, right? I mean, you can take any number of Heroku clones or functions as a service on Kubernetes, or Azure Functions has done a bunch of work to run on Kubernetes. You can take that and do it today. But the thing that you're missing that you would get with an app services or Azure Functions is the person, right, who's on call, who gets woken up if an alarm goes off. That's my picture of an alarm going off. And that's the thing that's missing, right? And so what we need to figure out how to do is how can we deliver that kind of service guarantee on top of AKS, with things like auto scaling and all that sort of stuff, so that you can have that PaaS-like experience still sitting on top of containers, so that you can drop down if you need to, or so that you can also at the same time run something in a Helm chart alongside your PaaS application. And so I don't necessarily and I don't want, this was the thing we debated a lot actually when we created ACI, was sort of like, how much orchestration should we put here, right? How much orchestration should be available for ACI? And the reason we did virtual nodes is because I really strongly believed the world doesn't need another orchestration API, even a really simple one. Right, I just don't believe that we should be bifurcating, that we should be creating this sort of bifurcated space. I'd much rather see us say, hey, look, we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna introduce new orchestration APIs. Sorry, my eraser is really laggy. But what we are gonna do is try and build higher level experiences. Maybe this is even something like no code. We're going to try and build higher level experiences that sit on top of the Kubernetes APIs that with virtual nodes sit on top of ACI. And so it's a more complicated stack when you look at the picture. Hopefully, the user doesn't necessarily see this picture. They just see the no code experience or the PaaS experience. But that's the direction we're pushing in, because I think one of the other things that's really important to realize is that more and more our developers aren't just thinking about this part, which is in Azure. They're thinking about this part also being, if I move it over a little bit, they're also thinking about this part being on the edge, or potentially even their own data centers. Data center. And in that world, they're going to have some other K8s here. Not AKS, but we still want to be able to deliver those exact same experiences. And we're starting to see this with Arc, right? So this is why Arc is so interesting to me, is we're starting to see, hey, you want SQL Server? Well, I can give you SQL Server via Kubernetes in your own data center, on the edge, in AKS, all with the exact same experience, right? And same thing with Azure Functions. And I think that's the trend in general for how we get to these simplified experiences, is to focus on making those higher level things more portable. So that's sort of the answer that I would give. I think that, I guess I'll taking another stab at this. I think when we think about PaaS, what has happened traditionally in the past is, if there were machines at the bottom here, mm-hmm. The PaaS has been built as this sort of very siloed kind of thing, and all of the PaaSes were built up and down, all the way from the user experience, all the way down to the machine. And I think, what we've seen is that Kubernetes has come along and kind of sliced out some of that. But if we still build these things in these vertical sort of monoliths, even if they're on top of Kubernetes, it's still very hard for them to talk to each other. And so what I'm really trying to push towards is a more componentized experience where, I love what you mentioned, Kata. I love what we did with Kata. That's a terrible, I don't know what happened there. It tried to do a shape. I love the intelligent shape thing that these things do usually, but then every once in a while it just totally messes up. I love what we did with Kata because it's this modular thing that you can use anywhere. And so, I see that something like Dapper is the same thing, right? So it's a little modular piece. And so I want us to see us build up these little modules that sort of fit together to ultimately deliver the developer experience at the top, rather than building these verticalized, complete, beautiful if you're inside them, but very tricky to interoperate kind of systems. Because I think historically that just hasn't worked out very well in the limit. And then everybody just goes back to the low-level infrastructure, and we don't make progress forward. So that's sort of where I'm at with that. Sorry, I feel like that was kind of a long answer, but
no, it's good. Of course. Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, then we go off to the next question. So the following question coming in, Kubernetes has quickly emerged as the de facto container orchestrator across all the major cloud platforms as well as on-prem. Is this a good thing because it offers choice, flexibility, and portability? Or is it a bad thing because the need for a generic platform can stifle the opportunity to differentiate on capability or features?
Well, I think ultimately it's a good thing, right? Because, portability, our customers require portability. Really, the world requires portability because, first of all, many of our customers are going to be in multiple clouds for a variety of reasons. Maybe you're a infrastructure provider like Snowflake, and you're just going to go to all the clouds because your customers tell you to go to all the clouds. Maybe your board has told you have to be in multiple clouds for reasons of financial liability. So many of our customers are multi-cloud, and they don't want to have multiple teams, right? They don't want to have a different team for each cloud and a different developer experience. For each cloud. That's really bad, because then if somebody wants to transition from team 1 to team 2, like, you've lost portability. You've lost skill portability. You've lost you've lost people's incentive, honestly, to stay at the company potentially, because if they want to leave their team, they may go someplace else rather than switch teams if it's too hard to switch teams, right? So I think there's a lot of customer value there. There's also a lot of ecosystem value, because it means that we can build projects, and when we build a project, it's just a project. It doesn't talk about what cloud it runs on. So if this is something, I've been doing some machine learning stuff lately. So like all of these machine learning tools that are out there, they just target Kubernetes. They don't target, Azure, or target, VMware, or target whatever, on-prem specific thing. They target Kubernetes, which means that as a user, you can take it and you can take it to whatever cloud you want, right? That means that more people come and use this tool, which means that the ecosystem grows and is better, and it's a very virtuous cycle, And I think that's hugely valuable, not just for, the cloud ultimately, because it's our customers. Our customers' success defines how good we are in the cloud, but also it's good just for the ecosystem of software, because it means that we're all focusing in on building together instead of everybody building for their own little silo. And we always do a better job. Just like there's more people, so we're going to do a better job if we're building together. I think for the question of differentiation, I think there's still a lot of opportunity for us to differentiate as well, because I think one of the things that we're doing with Azure is we're saying things like, hey, what's really important to people? Well, I think policy is really important. I think developer experience is really important. And so we're going to focus on some areas like this, like they call this broadly enterprise K8s. And developer experience we talked a lot about. And we're going to focus on this, and we're going to make these things be our differentiators, right? And we can actually do a lot, even in the context of an open API, to differentiate ourselves. And sometimes even the differentiation itself is actually open, right? So we've done a bunch of work with VS Code for Kubernetes and VS Code generally. Obviously, it works anywhere, right? But it still means that we are the experts on that tool. And so when our customers come to us and say, hey, how do I make my developers productive? I know I want this Kubernetes thing, but I have to make it work inside my enterprise environment with weird network, with some network admin who's saying that that there's this whole thing that you have to do. There's a checklist. I'll draw a little checklist. It's like a little checklist that the network people want you to fill out before you can go to production. How do I do this, right? How do I do this? How do I make my developers who've never done a container before, how do I make that developer productive, right? If the developer's like this, I think we can point to these things and even if they're open and even if they target everywhere and say, look, we know this, we built these things, we can help you along that journey. So it becomes sort of almost a cultural and information thing, as opposed to like, oh, this software only works in one place, right? And I think that's how you differentiate in cloud in general, I think, because, we're really not selling software, we're selling services. And so, we're not going to I don't think we're going to do a lot of differentiation based purely on software that's exclusive to us. It's going to be more about the holistic, like what do we empower? What do we enable you to do that you couldn't previously do?
Okay, so I want to move us on a little bit because it's not just containers that you're responsible for. You called out Dapper a few moments ago, and actually that's kind of cool because Mark Fussell is going to come and talk to us after yourself about Dapper. One of the things that Dapper's really, really great for is abstracting away some of the things that developers need in cloud applications, like managing their storage and instantiating state and that kind of things. And a lot of those ideas have come from Service Fabric. And given that move for Dapper, which is focused on Kubernetes as well as more cross-plat support, a lot of us who love the technology are wondering, where does this leave Service Fabric? Are you able to comment at all on how that might be developed in future?
Well, I think there's two parts to this. One is that that core infrastructure still powers important services from SQL to Intune. So like it's incredibly important infrastructure for the services that we develop inside of Microsoft. And similarly, I think what is interesting is, as you say, a lot of the ideas around developer and developer experience are really valuable, powerful ideas, right? And I think that I think there's a focus on trying to build things that are in this broader ecosystem, as I said. As I said, I think our customers require that systems that we build be things that they're familiar with and things that they're using on other clouds. And that's Kubernetes is filling that is the standard there, right? And so a lot of our focus is on saying, okay, like how do we think about improving developer productivity, and how do we take things that we've learned about how you can improve developer productivity and make them more broadly available. I think a great example of this actually in Dapper is that Dapper runs entirely as a bunch of sidecars, and so it's language agnostic. You want to talk to Dapper through Python? Fantastic. You want to talk through Go? Fantastic. Rust, C++, whatever language you want to use, you can talk to this sidecar. And that means that there isn't a really tight binding between a developer experience and a programming language. I think we're in a polyglot world for sure, and that's really critical. That no matter what language a company or a developer chooses, they can have access to the same set of tools. So I think there's a lot of there's lessons learned on both sides, and as with all software, what you do is you take the ideas and you iterate forward. And so I think that's what we're doing. I think it's always really important to listen and to focus on what your customers need, and where they have gaps and where you think you can help them. And that's what we do every day, and we continue to do. So.
Okay, good. Thank you. So let me check what else is coming in. Okay. So at this point, it feels overwhelming to grasp and keep up with the plethora of third-party tools and frameworks in the CNCF land space. However, some of these in relation to Kubernetes have a huge impact in working with containers. Which are your favorite tools and frameworks for the CNCF, effectively the ones you believe should never from a team's toolset, which one to be serious about Kubernetes, containers, AKS, etc.?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think this is an important question because I think there is a little bit of like, you know, it sort of reminds me, actually, I sort of joked with people a while ago, you know, I think all the infrastructure people got jealous of all the JavaScript front end people, because I remember when it's JavaScript front ends are still kind of the same way. Like there was a new framework every 2 weeks. Like every 2 weeks, the UX people who were next to me were like, "We're done with," and it was like insert whatever. Like I'll show that I'm old. It was like, "We're done with jQuery. We're moving on to Backplane. We're done with Backplane. We're moving on to Vue.js," or whatever. I'm not a UX guy, so I probably totally messed up the different frameworks for JavaScript. And so I started to joke that like the infrastructure people got jealous of everybody being hipster about their JavaScript frameworks, and so they created the CNCF to be an antidote to that. But I do think that sometimes people kind of adopt things just because they want to like talk about the thing that was on Hacker News or whatever. And so I would really focus people on, I always, whenever I'm talking to customers, I start with, what is your pain, right? Like, what is the thing that bugs you? Maybe it's that your monitoring system, you're not happy with your monitoring system. You can go use something like Prometheus. I think Prometheus is emerging as the sort of de facto standard, at least in terms of scrape format, in terms of presenting metrics. Now you could say, hey, for monitoring, I really want to use monitoring as a service, and I'm going to use Azure Monitor, which is great. I mean, I think actually you should use monitoring as a service if you can. But even there, that thing knows how to scrape Prometheus metrics, right? So and we know people who actually use Prometheus as a local aggregator before for collecting metrics inside the cluster before shipping them to Azure Monitor, so that they ship fewer metrics to Azure Monitor. So I think Prometheus is a really great tool. Grafana is not actually in the CNCF, but it's a great tool, which I think is another demonstration of the fact that you don't always have to be part of these foundations. HashiCorp has a bunch of great tools that aren't in the foundations. So I would really focus on what are the things you're trying to solve. Maybe it's distributed tracing, so you go look at Jaeger or other things. Maybe it's stuff in the event space, and you're going to go use cloud events and the cloud event spec. I wouldn't view the landscape as a checklist. And certainly there's stuff like Sandbox. I mean, so I know this from being on the CNCF technical oversight committee. There's stuff like CNCF Sandbox where like those projects, all they need to get in there is approval from 2 members of the committee. It's a super lightweight process, right? We really focus on making Sandbox be super, super lightweight. And so as a result, it's not necessarily a huge endorsement that a project is in the CNCF Sandbox. I would look more at things that are in incubation or going to graduation as a sign that the community has really rallied behind them. And so things like Helm, that are actually graduating into the full-on, Kubernetes, or sorry, not Kubernetes, the full-on CNCF projects like Kubernetes. I think Helm is used by like 80% of people who work with Kubernetes. So if Helm is something I would definitely recommend if you haven't already played around with it. So I think that's the way I'd approach it. Like, I do think there's a role that, I mean, I've talked about this before, if there's a role for us to play too, as kind of, we don't necessarily give people an opinionated stack right now, but I've sort of said, maybe we should just kind of like say, hey, these are the 6 things that we would use if we were you. And we do that in sort of one-on-one conversations, but we don't necessarily publish stuff like that. We kind of don't want to be kingmakers. But there's a real hunger out there, I think, for people to understand what is the things that are useful, and what are the things that are just sort of hype.
So, Brendan, one of the things I find a lot with the move to containerization is organizations use it as a very valid way of dealing with sticky bits of their old application, their legacy code, the things that are hard to move to more native cloud services. But whilst that's great as an accelerator for getting into the cloud, it's also potentially creating another anchor, right? Because they've dropped this legacy code into a container and they think that they can forget about it. They don't need to look at it. They don't need to rework it because it's in and it's functioning, right? What advice would you give to organizations to really make containerization a driver and enabler for improvement rather than just being a new hosting environment instead of a virtual machine?
Yeah, I think there is some value in, so let's say, you had a bunch of monoliths, or not monoliths, but a bunch of little apps over here. And you said, okay, actually, we're going to standardize everything in Kubernetes. But you end up with the same sort of like mix of random apps in Kubernetes. I think it's still a win to a degree, right? Because the API layer, you've given yourself a better API layer. And that's useful there. But I agree with you that if you just declared victory there, well, it kind of depends. I mean, maybe you drove your utilization. Maybe over here you were at like 10% CPU utilization, and here in Kubernetes land you're at 50% utilization. That might be the win, and that's okay. But you shouldn't necessarily think that you've changed your culture. I guess I would go back to what I said earlier about getting customers to understand where their pain is. I think that the problem that you're talking about is that actually a lot of the pain with that big monolithic app that somebody had, a lot of the pain comes from the fact that like you have team 1 and they contribute some code to that monolith, and you have team 2 and they contribute some code to that monolith, and you have team 3 and they contribute some code to that monolith. And now when it comes time to deploy, well, you have to coordinate. You have to get this sort of magical coordination between all of the teams in order to push code, in order for you to go from V1 to V2. And that coordination is really hard. And also sometimes there's a bug, right? So sometimes this team will have a bug. I do a really terrible job of drawing a bug. You wouldn't think that I have an art degree. I actually have a degree in art, but I was never a drawer. I never drew. Drawing was not my thing. So this team has a bug, and it ends up rolling back software. So you go back from V2 to V1, and it has an effect on these other two teams, right? And that's really painful for a lot of people. It means that the agility of your company is a lot slower. Your teams are frustrated. There's lots of like ship room meetings. Nobody can kind of move at their own pace. And so this is a real pain for a lot of people. And if all you do is take that monolith with, all those different teams, and you push it into Kubernetes, well, you haven't really changed anything, right? You still have that same problem with multiple teams going into the same binary. And so that's when I would say, like, oh, okay, now actually you need to really think about breaking this thing up because you haven't really achieved your goals, and you need to break this thing up so that, you extract out what this team works on. And maybe that's enough, right? Maybe team 1, the blue team stays and they have their monolith. And they get to keep the rest of the monolith. Or maybe even there's still a couple other teams that are still in that monolith. But by moving from 3 teams to 2 teams, you've reduced it a little bit. And maybe eventually this team can move out too. Because I think the other failure that I see is sort of this, like the failure of the parallel tracks, where a company says, okay, we're going to move to Kubernetes. But the way we're going to move to Kubernetes is we're going to start with our monolith over here, and it's V1. And then we're going to have Kubernetes over here, and we're going to build a beautiful new system with it perfectly architected in all the right ways and all the little microservices. But in the meantime, we're going to keep working on this. So we got V2 of the monolith over here. And by the time this thing's ready, this is V1 prime, say. By the time this whole thing is ready, it's this and not this. So it's not V2. And then people say, oh, well, no, you can't ship it because we need V2. And now you need to go spend some time catching up. So catch everybody up to V2. But by the time you finish and everybody's caught up to V2 in your new beautiful monolith or in your new beautiful Kubernetes system, they've built V3 of the monolith. And so like the sort of like, hey, we're going to build a firewall between the old thing and the new thing almost never works. You have to sort of, change the engines while the plane is still flying. And so that kind of incremental, I wouldn't say that shifting the monolith into Kubernetes is a bad thing, right? Probably the right first step is to shift the monolith into Kubernetes, but then breaking it apart, remembering that you still have to break it apart, and remembering why you wanted to break it apart. That's sort of like the second important piece. And I think more people are beginning to realize that pattern now than did previously.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Then let's check what else we have. Okay, so here's the next question, Brendan. Currently, when working on AKS, we will have development tools and languages for both platforms. We manage our clusters using ARM templates, Azure CLI, etc. on one hand. On the other hand, we are using YAML, Helm, charts, and this is actually an interesting one. Is it kubectl or kubectl? I'll take Brendan on the right way to say it.
Kubectl. That's what I say. I say kubectl. But I know plenty of people who say kubectl. But I've always said kubectl.
Then let's say kubectl. Good. So for managing what is running inside our cluster, are there any plans to make the management and provisioning of what is running inside our pipeline feel more native to the rest of Azure?
Yes. So I think the answer to that is yes. And I think we actually have active plans in both directions. So, you can say, hey, I'm in ARM land, and I want you to take that Kubernetes thing, and I want you to project it into ARM so that I can have sort of /pods, in my ARM template. But other people say the opposite, which is they say, hey, I'm over here in YAML land, and I like my YAML, and I'm in, using kubectl and things like that. I want you to take ARM and project it over here so that I can have, /VMs in my Kubernetes cluster. And these are both actually really valuable and important perspectives. And as we do Arc, and you can sort of see maybe where the name came from, but as we do Arc, we realize that we need to supply both. And so, we are simultaneously working on an ARM to Kubernetes bridge. So a bridge that will take Kubernetes and place it into ARM. We're also working on this thing called the service operator, which makes it possible to create Azure objects. It sort of takes Azure into Kubernetes. It makes it possible to create Azure objects using a Kubernetes native kubectl YAML workflow. So it kind of just depends on, where people's perspective. Do they want to be Kubernetes tooling centric, or do they want to be ARM centric? And we know that we really need to provide both experiences. So those are things that are being actively worked on right now. So as well as actually language improvements to ARM templates to make them a little bit less JSON-y. Because I think one of the other things that we talk to people about is how one of the reasons people prefer the work that they do in the Kubernetes config world is because the YAML is just a little bit cleaner and easier to read than JSON.
Okay. I'd quite like to throw a bit of a left field one at you now, Brendan, if that's okay.
Always.
Magnus Martinson, who he's one of the organizers of Global Azure Virtual, he said, if we gave you a wish, okay, you've got a pot of seed funding that you can give to anything at all inside the Azure family to develop to make it great, where would you go and spend that seed funding?
Like an existing thing to make great, or like a new thing?
Either or, it's your wish, right?
Man, there's a. Well, I mean, I think that there's a bunch of stuff I would love to just accelerate. Like, I mean, actually, the best thing that I wish we could do is just speed up time, right? Because like a bunch of the stuff we're working on, I really just want to see it. I know where it's going to go, or at least I really hope where it's going to go, like Arc. But it takes time to develop. It takes time to get there, and so I want to fast forward. Like, I want to fast forward 18 months. But if I could sort of fund a brand new effort, I mean, and I guess I'm also sort of lucky because I do actually just get to fund brand new efforts sometimes anyway. But I think that the work we're doing in the developer space that I talked about earlier is the most important, right? I think that it's still, I think about the fact that, and I think a lot of people think about the fact, but I sort of flash back to, let's say like 1998, and you have a database, and you have, a console, or not a console, you have a graphical single machine app talking to that database. It's sort of a forms over data kind of app. And you have something like VS Code or VS that you built this app from with a designer and all this stuff. This whole thing, this is about the apex of, that's not great, but anyway, this is about the apex of development, in my opinion, right? In terms of ease of developers, right? I mean, I think back to friends that I had fresh out of college, history degree, having software engineering jobs or even companies based on this whole thing, right? The tools were that easy, the development was that easy, right? And fast forward to 2020, and it's a mess, I mean, it's like I mentioned all those graphical frameworks. It's just like nothing but question marks, right? And a bunch of tools that sort of work, but nothing that provides you with as sort of integrated an experience. The whole IDE part here, we've lost a lot of the I, right? The integration part. And that's a shame. I mean, there's a lot of really good reasons for this. Like, this architecture doesn't work anymore, right? The old architecture, it doesn't work with smartphones. It doesn't work with tablets. That's my smartphone. It doesn't work with tablets. It doesn't work with shared state between those devices or between people. So there's nothing like Office 365 where I can share my docs between people. Like, expectations have changed, right? So this architecture doesn't work anymore. But in changing the architecture to adapt to the business requirements of people and devices, we've actually put a ton of pain on the developer. And so, like, if I could, wave a wand, I think that's the thing that I would focus as. I mean, and we are trying, right? We are focusing our energy on that. But that's the thing that I think is the most, like, that I feel the most urgency about. Because at some level, like, we're doing the world a disservice, right? Like, we should be making this easier. Like, that should be our number one job, is making that thing easier. And I think it's just really, really hard. I mean, some of the things I tell people about, I'm like, well, like, look, this 1998 experience, if you considered it sort of the apex, it took 20 years at least to get there, right? I mean, it took from, the mid 70s, maybe even earlier, through to 1998 of people making better and better development tools to get there. It's going to take a while for us to get here, right? And I don't know when the clock starts. The clock maybe starts in like 2008, 2010. So we got another 10 years. We got at least another 10 years of like trying to make the development tools better before we get to a place that I think is going to be reasonable. But that's probably the place that I feel the most urgency about.
So actually tying what you were just saying there about improving the dev experience to something that you mentioned a few minutes ago. JSON would not be my first choice of language for infrastructure as code, although I can totally see why the ARM guys picked it. and I realize it's my personal preference, but I hate YAML with a passion. Are there any initiatives maybe being incubated at the moment? Are you thinking about maybe changing how some of that infrastructure as code is built, and the way that we have to write it to make it more developer friendly, maybe human readable, maybe easier to check, that kind of thing?
Yeah, no, we're absolutely thinking about this a bunch. I have this experiment out on GitHub that I played around with. That's it's kind of React-like, that integrates Python and YAML together into a sort of a more, I would think, more sort of single readable thing. Because I think one of the challenges you see with all this stuff, one is like just the syntax, right? Like the curly braces and commas of JSON, whatever. But the other is the fact that we're actually combining two things, right? You're combining data and program. Like, because every significant ARM template or every significant config file has some aspect of like loops or conditionals or whatever. And so you're combining these two things together, and it's really hard to do that in an elegant way, right? Because if you go fully programmatic, then your data is really annoying because you're constantly like declaring variables to hold data that just feels verbose. But if you go fully data, then you're doing things like you do in the ARM template language, where you say like, loop, which is a really bad way to, specify a loop. And so absolutely thinking about how we make this better. We have some prototypes. Other people obviously also do too. There's companies like Pulumi who are thinking about this. The spectrum sort of goes from pure data on one side, which is sort of, which is basically ARM templates of today, like pure DSL, or through to Pulumi, which is like, it's all just programming languages. I don't think either of these approaches is going to work really great. I think that we should sort of try and land somewhere in between. Or we should just admit that there's just going to be a bunch of solutions, right? And I think actually a piece of both is actually where we're going to land, where we try and develop a language that's a little bit more programmy, but is also sort of data oriented, but also admit that there's going to be Terraform. There's going to be some things like Pulumi. There's going to be people who want to just do YAML. And how do we, just as with programming languages, I'm not sure we'd ever say, hey, there's going to be one programming language to rule them all. I think we have to admit that there are going to be different config languages that suit different tools and different people, or even just people's style, people's just personal style. And how do we live in a world like that? Is how I think about it. Although clearly there's a room for improvement, right? Like clearly we should do something because, it's painful today. And I think one of the other reasons that things like JSON and YAML are challenging is that they weren't necessarily built with tooling in mind, right? It was a language choice that was made by people who weren't thinking about like, how do I build a really great editor experience around this? And so I think taking a step back and actually looking at how people use these things today and figuring out what's important to them and saying, okay, well, actually, we really need to deliver a great editor experience. And that's a requirement for the language. That's not something we try and bolt on the side. That's a requirement for whatever language we build. I think stuff like that will also go a long way to making it more tractable. Because, as we've seen with some of these sort of uber verbose languages like, Java or even C# like they're languages that were built for tab complete, right? Like they're much less fun to use if you don't have an integrated development environment that's intelligent about taking away, the annoying parts of the language.
Okay. Thanks, Brendan. So we have a couple minutes left. And what we would actually like to know is at the beginning of the call, you mentioned you're sitting in your basement. Rick is sitting at home. I'm sitting at home. We're all kind of stuck in this current situation. So how has it been for you in the past weeks? Like, are you always working from home in the basement now, or how has your life changed?
Sure. Drop my screen share. So I've been lucky in a couple different ways. I was lucky in that Seattle decided to have the driest first like 4 weeks of 3 weeks of April that Seattle has had. I think we're not going to be the driest month on record, but pretty close. So it was beautiful. So I was actually mostly working from my yard.
Oh, that's nice.
Which is really nice, right? And I actually got a sunburn, so which I was surprised by. I was like, wait a minute. So
in
that's
April.
In April, exactly. In Seattle, right? I was like, in April in Seattle. It's not. I think my body just wanted to be in Hawaii. So I that was nice. It helped a lot. I work from home a little bit anyway, and I'm also lucky because my teams have been pretty remote friendly historically, and so my teams adjusted to this pretty well. I'm lucky because my family's in a situation where having the kids home they've been great, and my wife has really helped a lot. She's great at making sure that they stay on track and things like that. So I feel really. I guess I would not complain at all about the things that we've gone through, because I think that I've seen a lot of people who are in way more challenging situations.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, I think we've made the adjustments. I think one of the most important things one of my teammates said was, pretty early on, we started treating this like it was going to be the new normal, right? It wasn't sort of like, oh, hey, let's, we're going to just sort of somehow, gut check our way through this for the next 3 weeks. It was like, no, we're going to be in this mode for at least a couple months.
For a long time.
For a long time, right? So like, get the ergonomics right? Get that monitor in the right place. Get a nice chair if you need a nice chair. Get a nice chair.
Yeah. Get a tan in the yard.
Yeah. Get a tan in the yard. Yeah.
Yeah. So you also said earlier you used to be a college professor. Are you homeschooling your children now at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think we're all sort of becoming a little bit more teachers, but my kids are also in remote classes, Zoom based, and Teams. One of them uses Zoom. One of the schools uses Zoom. The other uses Teams. So there's a mix. But obviously it's different, In some ways it's easier because I don't have to be like, hey, we're going out the door. Is everybody? I'm like, did you get dressed and hop on your iPad?
We're all at home.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, Brenda, but we need to break. But I've been asked by the producers, quickfire round, tabs or spaces.
Whatever my IDE does. I like the tab key, right? But my IDE turns tabs into spaces.
Hedge like a true diplomat. Okay,
that's right.
We're going to take a 5-minute break now. We'll be back shortly with Mark Fussell talking about Dapper. Thanks very much.